A single headline. 3 words in German. Patton, Kriegsverbrecher. Murder. Patton, war criminal. Murderer. It ran in the Frankfurter Rundschau in the autumn of 1944, reprinted in occupied papers across the Reich's crumbling interior, broadcast on Wehrmacht radio to soldiers still holding the Siegfried Line. The Nazi propaganda machine had found its villain, not Eisenhower, not Bradley, not the faceless bureaucrats of Schaff in London. They chose Patton, specifically, deliberately, because they understood something that some American newspapers were only beginning to suspect, that George S. Patton was the single most dangerous man the Allied armies had produced, and the only way to slow him down was to make him radioactive. It almost worked. But here is what you are not told in most histories. While the German press was printing those headlines, a company of men from Patton's own Third Army was 23 kilometers east of Metz, preparing to assault a fortified position the Wehrmacht had spent 4 months making impregnable. 11 men, 1 lieutenant, 1 objective, 0 room for error. The German garrison commander, Oberstleutnant Werner Brandt, had received the propaganda dispatches. He had read the headlines. He had briefed his officers with something close to contempt. The Americans advancing on his position were led by officers trained under a man the civilized world had just labeled a butcher. Unserious soldiers, he said. Soldiers who break under pressure. He was wrong about almost everything. But here is the question that will keep you watching. How does a commander fight a battle he is not allowed to fight, while his own country is trying to destroy him? September 27, 1944. Moselle Valley, Lorraine, France. By late September, the Allied advance that had swept like fire across France since the breakout at Avranches had ground into something uglier and slower. Fuel was the problem. The Red Ball Express, the legendary truck convoy that had kept Patton's tanks moving, was running dry. Schaff had made its decision. Supply priority went to Operation Market Garden in the north. Patton's Third Army, which had covered more ground faster than any armored force in history, was being throttled. In 6 weeks, Third Army had liberated over 10,000 square miles of French territory. Now, in the Lorraine campaign, and the front had narrowed to a brutal grinding match around a city that had resisted conquest since the Roman era, Metz. Metz was not simply a city. It was a fortress system, a ring of 19 interlocking forts constructed between 1870 and 1914, modernized by the Germans in the 1930s, and now garrisoned by elements of the 462nd Volksgrenadier Division. Fort Dryant alone had held against a full American divisional assault in early September, costing the 5th Infantry Division over 500 casualties without yielding a single gun emplacement. The official Army assessment, filed September 14th, called Fort Dryant a position of unusual defensive strength, presenting significant obstacles to direct assault. That was headquarters language, for we have no idea how to take this thing. What Patton needed was not another frontal assault, and what he needed was a gap. And in the network of secondary roads and creek beds, southeast of the main fortress ring, intelligence had identified exactly that, a potential gap at a supply depot and communications node called Ferme de la Croix Rouge, the Red Cross Farm, located on a low ridge above the village of Vaux. If that depot could be neutralized, the eastern approach to Metz could be opened for a flanking column. Enter Lieutenant James R. Tolliver, 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, age 26, from Decatur, Alabama. Tolliver was not a dramatic man. His commanding officer, Captain Frederick Ham, described him in a fitness report as methodical, quiet, and possessed of an intuitive spatial intelligence that makes him exceptional at terrain reading. His men called him Toll. He had a photograph in his left breast pocket, not of a sweetheart, but of his mother standing in front of the hardware store his father owned on Ponce de Leon Avenue. He had carried it since North Africa. His unit was Able Company's 3rd Platoon, reinforced with a 4-man combat engineer team and a forward observer from the 94th Armored Field Artillery Battalion, 12 men total. Their mission, as written by S2 at Battalion, infiltrate past the eastern edge of the Metz outer perimeter along a creek bed marked on the map as Ruisseau du Moulin, reach Ferme de la Croix-Rouge before first light on September 28th, destroy the fuel and communications infrastructure, and withdraw before German reaction forces could organize. The intelligence that made this mission possible had come from a French resistance contact, a former postal worker named Marcel Renaud, who claimed detailed knowledge of German patrol schedules in the Vaud corridor. He had provided grid references, patrol timings, and a hand-drawn map showing a 2-hour window between 02:30 and 04:30, when the creek approach would be unguarded. One flaw lived in the plan, and only Tolliver knew it. The creek bed on Renault's hand-drawn map did not match the Army survey map issued to the platoon. The survey map showed the creek bending southeast 600 meters short of the farm. Renault's map showed it bending northeast. One of those maps was wrong. Tolliver had flagged this discrepancy to Captain Ham 24 hours before mission launch. Ham had taken it to S2. S2 had replied, in writing, "Trust the source. Renault has been reliable for 6 months. Proceed as planned." Tolliver had folded that reply, placed it in his field notebook, and said nothing more. He trusted the Army's intelligence apparatus. He had no reason not to. 40 kilometers to the east, in a requisitioned farmhouse outside Bouzonville, Oberstleutnant Werner Brandt of the 1462nd Grenadier Regiment was eating dinner with his staff. His regiment held the eastern approaches Tolliver was preparing to penetrate. One of his officers, Hauptmann Klaus Richter, the regimental intelligence officer, had placed the propaganda clippings on the dinner table. Brandt had read them, set them aside, and made a remark his aide later recorded in a diary entry. "Wenn Patton Verbrecher sind, dann kämpfen Verbrecher schlecht. Wir haben nichts zu fürchten. If Patton's men are criminals, then criminals fight poorly. We have nothing to fear." He ordered 2 platoons of his garrison rotated off the Vaud perimeter that night. They had been there 6 weeks. They needed rest. The American pressure, he believed, would remain focused on Fort Dryant to the north. That decision, moving 2 platoons off the Vaud corridor on the same night Tolliver's unit would move through it, would define everything that followed. 0130 hours, September 28, 1944. Ruisseau du Moulin, east of Vaud. The creek bed was wrong. Tolliver knew it within 8 minutes of entering the approach. The soil was too soft, the banks too high, and the bend came 200 meters early, northeast, exactly as his survey map had shown, not southeast, as Renault's hand-drawn chart promised. And the farm was not where it should be. He halted the column. 12 men in the dark, breathing through their mouths, listening to the sound of distant artillery working the northern forts. Private First Class Ernest D. Dawkins, 22, Nashville, Tennessee, who had been on point, came back and crouched beside Tolliver without being told. "Map's wrong," he said. It was not a question. "One of them is," Tolliver replied. He had 4 options. Abort, which would require a 2-kilometer withdrawal under blackout conditions with unknown enemy positions. Wait for daylight, which would eliminate their concealment window entirely. Advance on bearing using terrain navigation, which meant abandoning the creek bed and moving through open ground. Or split the unit, in sending a 2-man reconnaissance element ahead while the main body held at the creek. He chose to send Dawkins and Corporal Alexander Wozniak, a Polish-American from Hamtramck, Michigan, forward on foot, bearing 045. They had 30 minutes. They came back in 22. The farm was there. Renault's directions were correct as to location, wrong only as to the creek path. But Dawkins had seen something else, something that was not in any intelligence report. "There's a machine gun nest on the north side of the barn," Dawkins said, his voice entirely flat. "And there are tracks. Half-track tracks, sir. Fresh." Wozniak held up 3 fingers. 3 vehicles. Minimum. Read those numbers again. 3 armored half-tracks at a position intelligence had described as a lightly guarded supply depot with 4 sentries. And the mission profile was built on 8 men holding a perimeter while engineers destroyed fuel stores. Against half-tracks, 8 men holding a perimeter become 8 dead men. Tolliver got on the radio. What happened next is documented in the 37th Tank Battalion's radio log, preserved in the National Archives at College Park, Maryland. At 02:04 hours, Tolliver transmitted a request for clarification of enemy strength at grid reference 449.227 and a request to delay mission execution pending re-reconnaissance. The response, logged at 0211, came directly from Battalion S3. Execute as ordered. Corps timetable requires VO neutralized by 0500. No delay authorized. Corps timetable. Somewhere above Tolliver, a deadline had been created, and now 12 men in a creek bed were subordinate to it. He looked at the radio handset for a long moment. In Sergeant Frank Calabrese, 31, Brooklyn, New York, his platoon sergeant, a man who had been in the Army since 1936 and had fought from Tunisia to Metz, watched him from 2 feet away and said nothing, which was its own kind of communication. Tolliver gave the order to advance. They were 40 meters from the tree line when the flare went up. Not 1 flare. 4. Illumination rounds fired simultaneously from positions north, east, and south, lighting the approach like a sudden noon. The machine gun opened from the barn, not where Dawkins had marked it, but from a second position, closer, on the south wall. The first burst took down Private George Sutton, 20 years old, from Terre Haute, Indiana, who had been walking 3 meters to Tolliver's right. Sutton went down without a sound. Then the half-tracks started their engines. At the next 90 seconds were the kind of thing that exists differently in memory than in reality. Tolliver's after-action report describes it in 7 clinical sentences. The radio intercepts from the German side tell a different story. Brandt's duty officer, filed a report at 0218, noting contact with an American infiltration element of unknown strength that was behaving unexpectedly, not retreating toward the creek as anticipated, but going to ground and returning fire with considerable accuracy and discipline. The unit was not supposed to be able to fight back. They were supposed to run. They didn't run. But they were in the worst position imaginable. The tree line gave partial cover. Sutton was hit and couldn't be moved under fire. The radio, when Calabrese tried it again, I returned static. The antenna had caught a round in the first burst. They had no contact with battalion. The half-tracks were moving, circling north and south to complete an encirclement. 12 men. Against what Tolliver now estimated, correctly, as German records later confirmed, was a reinforced platoon of 38 grenadiers and 3 SDKFZ 251 half-tracks. 3-1, cut off. 1 man down. No radio. No backup authorized, even if the radio worked. Tolliver pressed his back against an elm tree, looked at Calabrese, and asked a question that Calabrese would quote 30 years later in an interview with the Veterans of Foreign Wars magazine. "Frank, what would Patton do with a map that was wrong?" This video gives you the story. But the Combat Blueprint, our free newsletter, gives you everything that doesn't fit in a video. Deeper details. Forgotten Heroes free to join. 10 seconds to sign up. Link in the description. Now back in the video, Calabrese's answer would become the pivot of the entire battle. But first, in that farmhouse in Bouzonville, Hauptmann Richter, the same officer who had spread the propaganda clippings on Brandt's dinner table, was dictating a message to regimental headquarters. His tone had shifted. The Americans at Val, he wrote, had not broken on contact as expected. Their fire was disciplined, and their movement, even under illumination, was tactically coherent. He requested guidance. Brandt's response was dismissive. The encirclement was complete. Wait them out. Calabrese didn't answer Tolliver's question directly. Instead, he said 4 words. He'd go around it. Every officer in Patton's Third Army knew the principle by heart, because Patton had made them memorize it, not as theory, as doctrine. He had stated it in writing in a command memorandum distributed to all unit commanders in August 1944, and he had said it in person at briefings across the theater. Never try to go through the enemy's strength. Find his flank. If he has no flank, make one. The principle had a name inside Third Army. Officers called it the Patton Bypass, though Patton himself would have rejected the name as too soft, too defensive sounding for what he actually meant. What he meant was aggressive indirection, not avoidance. Attack from the direction the enemy has not prepared for because he did not believe you could get there. And Patton had put it more bluntly at a command conference in Nancy in September. An obstacle is an invitation. It tells you where the enemy is not. Think about what that means. An obstacle, a minefield, a fortified position, a ridgeline, a flooded creek, tells you exactly where the enemy has focused his attention, his resources, his firepower, which means it also tells you, as precisely as any map, where he has not focused those things. The obstacle is not a wall. It is a sign. Tolliver, lying in the dark with German half-tracks completing a circle around his position, read the sign. The encirclement was moving north and south. The logic was sound. The creek approach was to the west, so the enemy was cutting off the western withdrawal. Their eastern coverage, the direction away from the Allied lines, a deeper into German-held territory, was thin. Why would Americans try to escape by going further into enemy territory? Because, Tolliver understood, there was something in that direction. The village of Vaux itself, 300 meters east, with a civilian population that German standing orders required to be protected from crossfire situations. Standard Wehrmacht doctrine. Brandt was a professional, not an SS thug, would not permit his half-tracks to fire into a populated area. Here was the civilian calculus that doctrine writers at Schaff had never had to face in a training exercise. Tolliver could use the village as cover. Move through the eastern edge of Vaux. Use the buildings as concealment, and emerge north of the farm complex, behind the German perimeter, where the fuel stores were lightly guarded because Brandt had positioned his firepower to face west. It would work. It could work. But it meant moving 12 men, 11 now, with Sutton down, through a civilian village in the dark, in the middle of an active firefight, while German forces were present in adjacent buildings. Private Dawkins asked the question that needed to be asked. What happens to those people if this goes wrong? Tolliver spent 4 seconds answering. Calabrese remembered the pause exactly because he checked his watch during it. If we stay here, Tolliver said, and those half-tracks close the circle, this becomes a sustained firefight 200 meters from their houses, and neither side has a reason to stop. If we move east, now we draw the fight away from Vaux, not into it. We're the ones who have to move fast enough to keep the civilians out of it. He ordered Calabrese to take Sutton, still alive, conscious, hit in the left shoulder, and 2 men on a direct line to the northern edge of Vaux. He would take the remaining 6 men east through the village itself, and they would converge at the fuel stores from opposite directions at 0315. If your father, grandfather, or great-grandfather served in Patton's Third Army, if they carried a map through the Lorraine campaign, if they ever mentioned the Moselle Valley, or the name Metz, I want to hear about it in the comments. Unit, campaign, and where they ended up. Those stories live in family memory and nowhere else. 0247 hours. Eastern edge of Vaux. The village was not asleep. Light showed under 2 doors. A dog began barking the moment Tolliver's element entered the eastern lane, a sound that stopped his heart before an elderly woman's voice silenced it from a window above. The woman looked down at him, looked at the rifle, looked at the American uniform. She said one word in French, very quietly. Vite. Quickly. He moved quickly. The lane was 40 meters long between a stone wall and a row of connected houses. Beyond the northern end, open ground. Beyond the open ground, the backside of Ferme de la Croix Rouge, the fuel storage area, a wooden barn structure, and 2 above-ground petrol tanks that looked, in Tolliver's recollection, like exactly what they were. Exposed, lightly covered, and representing roughly 2,000 liters of Wehrmacht diesel. The German half-tracks were audible to the west. They had not repositioned east, and Brandt's logic had held. He had not considered that the trapped Americans would advance rather than retreat. Wozniak, moving point, raised a fist, stopped. 1 sentry. North face of the fuel barn. Standing, smoking, facing west toward the sound of his own vehicles. Wozniak looked back at Tolliver. Tolliver made a flat-handed gesture. Hold. Then he pointed to himself and to the right. He would go wide. He was 15 meters from the sentry when the radio that wasn't supposed to work crackled to life. The antenna Calabrese had spliced in the creek bed, using wire stripped from a field telephone coil he had been carrying since Belgium, had made a connection. The battalion frequency opened. And on that frequency, at the worst possible moment, it's a voice Tolliver did not recognize began reading a revised grid coordinate for the withdrawal route, loudly, twice, in clear text. The sentry turned. Wozniak moved before Tolliver could signal otherwise. What happened next took less than 12 seconds and is described in exactly 3 sentences of Tolliver's after-action report, filed October 2nd, in language so compressed it contains almost nothing. Contact with sentry at North Fuel Barn, 0249. Sentry neutralized. Element continued to objective. The engineers came up. 2 men carrying canvas satchels that had been on their backs for 4 hours. They went to work on the petrol tanks with thermite charges, preset, 45-second fuses, while Tolliver established a perimeter with the remaining 4 men. Then the half-tracks came around the northern edge of the farm. Not 1, 2, and the third was still west, blocking the creek approach. But 2 had completed the northern arc and were now 30 meters away, headlights sweeping, moving in the slow, methodical way of vehicles hunting something they expect to find any moment. Short sentences now, because that is what the moment demands. Tolliver had 2 rifle grenades left. He used one on the lead vehicle's track assembly. The detonation rocked the half-track sideways and stopped it. Not destroyed, immobilized. The second vehicle stopped. Spotlight came on. Found Tolliver. He was already moving. Calabrese came in from the north. He had moved along the creek bed's northern branch, the survey map creek bed, the accurate one, and emerged 60 meters behind the second half-track. And he had 4 men, and he had a .30 caliber light machine gun that PFC Dawkins was carrying in 2 pieces, assembled in 40 seconds on a tree root while German spotlights swept the barn. The machine gun opened from a direction the half-track crew had never anticipated and could not immediately locate. The vehicle reversed. It reversed into the burning fuel barn. The thermite charges detonated at 0302. The explosion was visible from the battalion observation post, 4.7 kilometers to the west. The duty officer logged it at 0304. He also logged the radio transmission that came in from Tolliver's repaired antenna at 0306. Able 36 to battalion. Objective neutralized. Have casualties. Withdrawing south. 1 casualty? Not 1. Sutton, already hit, had been hit again during Calabrese's movement north. A second round in the right thigh. He's serious, but not fatal. Wozniak had a laceration on his left arm from something that happened in those 12 seconds at the fuel barn, the origin of which he never fully explained, and which Tolliver did not document. 11 men had gone in. 11 came out. But coming out was not a clean process. It was a 1.5 kilometers of movement under the light of their own burning objective, carrying a man on a makeshift litter made from rifle slings and a broken door, with the sound of German vehicles reorganizing to the north. At the farmhouse in Bauzonville, Hauptmann Richter, was no longer writing with the calm tone of a man documenting a routine action. His 0315 message to regimental headquarters, captured with other records by 3rd Army G2 in November 1944, and reads, "The American element at Vaux has destroyed the Fermé depot and withdrawn in good order under encirclement. Their route of withdrawal passed through the village, rendering vehicle pursuit impossible without civilian casualties. Request guidance." This unit's behavior is not consistent with the intelligence assessment of American infiltration capability. Brandt's reply arrived at 0340. Hold position. Await daylight assessment. Richter did not wait. He drove to the farmhouse personally, arriving at 0350, and spent the next hour reviewing what had happened. He was, by all accounts, a thorough and professional officer. What he found at Fermé de la Croix-Rouge, the burning tanks, the immobilized half-track, the entry route through Vaux, and the geometry of Calabresi's machine gun position told him a story about the men he had just fought that bore no resemblance to the contemptuous headlines his commander had placed on the dinner table 5 hours earlier. Brandt arrived at first light. He stood at the fuel barn. He asked Richter what had happened. Richter showed him the tracks, the entry point, the firing positions, the improvised antenna repair in the creek bed, the two-axis convergence that had neutralized his encirclement by using his own vehicle's movement pattern against him. Brandt said nothing for a long time. Then, "Wer hat das befallen?" Who ordered this? "Ein Leutnant," Richter said. A lieutenant. "Patton's man," Brandt said. Not a question. If this story of Lieutenant Tolliver and Able Company has stayed with you, the kind of storytelling that brings these men back to life, that gives names to the soldiers who never made the history books. But the Combat Blueprint, our free newsletter, gives you everything that doesn't fit in a video. Free to join. 10 seconds to sign up. Now back in the video Dawn, September 28th, 1944. Aid Station, 37th Tank Battalion, east of Metz. The battlefield at Vaux looked like battlefields always look after the guns stop. Smaller than the fight inside it, uglier in daylight than it seemed in darkness. A burning barn, a half-track with a shattered track assembly listing into a ditch. Tire marks in wet grass. Brass casings around a tree root where Dawkins had set up the machine gun. No bodies except the one. George Sutton was alive. He was evacuated to the 77th Evacuation Hospital on the morning of September 28th and underwent surgery the same afternoon. He survived. He returned to Decatur, Alabama, after the war, and worked at his uncle's garage for 40 years. He never spoke about Vaux until 1974, when his daughter asked him why he walked with a limp. James Tolliver filed his after-action report on October 2nd. It ran to 7 pages and contained no heroic language. It contained one recommendation, that the discrepancy between field source intelligence maps and Army survey maps be formally flagged as a pre-mission verification requirement. S2 at Battalion acknowledged the recommendation and filed it. Whether it changed anything is not documented. The German side of the record is more revealing. When 3rd Army G2 captured the Balsamville farmhouse in November 1944, they found Richter's reports intact. His November assessment of the Lorraine Campaign's eastern approach operations included a section on the Vaux engagement that was later translated and forwarded to Army intelligence. In clinical German professional prose, Richter wrote that the American unit at Ferme de la Croix-Rouge had demonstrated a level of tactical flexibility under encirclement that exceeded our intelligence projection for company-grade American leadership. He noted specifically the use of civilian terrain as a fire-free buffer zone, interpreting it correctly as a deliberate decision, not a lucky accident. He wrote, "This kind of battlefield judgment, reading the enemy's doctrine against him, using his own rules of engagement as a maneuver corridor, is not the work of an undisciplined force. It is Patton's method, again applied at the lowest level of command." Werner Brandt survived the war. He was interviewed by the U.S. Army's historical program in 1947. He was asked about the Vaux engagement specifically. His answer was straightforward. "I had been told that Patton's men were criminals who fought with brutality rather than skill. At Vaux, I saw skill, considerable skill. I was wrong to dismiss the intelligence warning about their approach. I had assumed that a man working under a disgraced commander would fight with the disgraced commander's chaos. I was wrong. Patton's men fought like Patton thought." That sentence, "Patton's men fought like Patton thought," is the whole lesson. Patton himself received a brief summary of the Vaux engagement from his G3 on the morning of September 29th. He was, at that moment, simultaneously managing the Metz assault, the fuel crisis that threatened to ground his armor, and the ongoing political effort by Schaff to limit his operational authority. He read the summary. He made one notation in the margin, in his distinctive handwriting, and returned it to his aide. The notation read, "Correct. This is what I asked for." Nothing more. Because Patton's whole philosophy, the thing the German press was trying to destroy by labeling him a butcher, the thing that Brandt had dismissed over dinner, the thing that Richter documented with reluctant professional respect in a stone farmhouse, was never about violence for its own sake. It was about thinking faster than the enemy, moving through his logic before he could apply it, reading the obstacle and going around it, over it, through the gap he didn't know he'd left. And the German headlines called him a war criminal because they had no other framework for a commander who consistently produced soldiers who acted at a lieutenant's level the way Patton acted at an army level with aggressive intelligence, without waiting for permission to adapt. They tried to make him radioactive. Instead, they made him a lesson. On a ridge above the village of Vaux, in the Moselle department of Lorraine, France, there is a small stone marker placed there in 1984 by the commune of Vaux in coordination with American veterans organizations. It is not a grand monument. It gives a date, September 28, 1944, and a unit designation, 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, 3rd United States Army, and 3 words in French. Ils ont passé. They passed through. On the back face of the stone, someone, the records don't say who, added a single line in English at some point after the original installation. It is not official. It is not authorized. It is simply there. Patton's men. Correct. This is what I asked for. If your father, grandfather, or great-grandfather served in Patton's Third Army, in the Lorraine Campaign, at Metz, along the Moselle, or anywhere from Avranches to the Rhine, I want to know about it. What unit? What campaign? What town did they liberate? What did they never talk about? And what did they finally tell you before they left? Drop it in the comments. These men are not in the official histories. They are in your family's memory, and your memory is the only archive that matters now.